So we're going to finish up with a discussion of slavery, and then we're going to move to the Enlightenment today. And I would say I've gotten some feedback from students who are putting together their final version of the essay. And what I find encouraging is that there's a real sort of sense of people are becoming self-conscious about the process of writing. And that's exactly what I'm trying to develop here, a sense that writing is a self-conscious process, and um, sort of revising the text and putting things in different places to make it better. All of that is part of the writing process. So insofar as you're doing this, you really are learning a skill, and it's, as I've said many times, it's an important skill in terms of your futures. Indeed, I would, this occurs to me, that is to say, of course, some of you, you're involved in professional courses, you're studying various sciences, technology, all the rest of it. But here we teach a sense of versatility in addition to literacy. There's a sense that you get these general critical skills, how to write, how to criticize text, to understand the logic of different texts. And I would argue that in terms of your overall education and even your employment, that sort of critical facility and the fact that you can use that critical facility to do all kinds of jobs actually helps you in terms of employment, bottom line. So this is not all pie in the sky sort of extra stuff. What you're learning here can be important to you. So let's go back to slavery. And remember I said toward the end of the last discussion that the development of industrial capitalism, it seems to be clear, slavery played a significant role in the sense that huge profits were made by the English and the other European powers, the French, the Dutch, and these were remitted back to Europe and went into the banks, and the early industrialists loaned money from these banks. This capital became available to them for building factories. Secondly, the products of these new factories, the iron and steel products, the textiles, found markets in the Caribbean and in Latin America and in the American South, the plantations. You had to clothe people, you had to give them tools, and so this whole sort of plantation slave system was a very important market. And finally, also we should point out that the colonists in the New World, in the American colonies in the Maritimes, they sold things like dairy product, butter, rum, wheat, and other products to the Caribbean. Canada was that is to say, the Maritimes made a lot of money out of this trade. And so what they did with the money was they bought manufactured goods from England. So what happened in the 18th century was the Atlantic became the center of the world economy. There was what historians describe as a commercial revolution. And at the focal point of this commercial revolution in the Atlantic was products either produced by the slaves or consumed by the slaves. The slave trade, the plantations were at the focal point of all this. So having underlined the importance of slavery to the development of capitalism, let's talk a little bit now about the effects of slavery on Africa. What happened to Africa? I explained last time that the Greeks and Romans are very at the focal point of those ancient societies. Slave labor, slaves which were taken in war, played a big role in ancient Rome and Greece. And then this continued in the Mediterranean in the Middle Ages. In the Arab countries, the Arabs took slaves from Russia, that area, but also from Africa. And this was a significant part of the Mediterranean economy in the Middle Ages. Also, places like Italy and Spain, there was a certain amount of slave labor being used. I also pointed out last time that Africa had its civilizations during the late Middle Ages and into the modern period. Places like Ethiopia and Zimbabwe, Ghana, Mali, Sangay, they had political states, social classes, Iron Age technology, monumental building, and various forms of writing, particularly Arabic, was because a lot of the sort of merchants on the coast of Africa became Muslims. The Arabic language was common, and so in Africa there was civilization, just as in the Middle East or Europe or what have you. One of the distinguishing marks about African society was that the accumulation of wealth by holding land was very limited. Wealth was land was held by the community, and the chief of the tribes or the kingdoms basically he held the land in trust for the community. You could not sell land. You could not inherit land. It was only through the community that land could be exploited. And so accumulating land as a form of wealth was not possible. Rather, in Africa, and I might say that, notice that, for example, in the Ottoman Empire or in India or in Iran, or for that matter in Russia, the arrangement was rather similar. Not the same, but this idea of absolute property rights really didn't exist in any of these societies. Land was, in theory, everything belonged to the community through the ruler, and there was a distribution or redistribution of land based on the good of the community. However, in Africa, influential members of the community could accumulate a certain amount of wealth by the virtue of the fact that polygamy was allowed, and you could accumulate wives who would work for you. In terms of marriage, economic arrangements were important of this sort. And that's, of course, true even today. I mean, marriage, amongst other things that it is an economic arrangement. And your children would work for you and so on, do you service. If you were a big, an influential male, and also slaves. You could accumulate slaves. But I would say that the slaves, usually obtained through war, um, they, in effect, in the African setup, they were included as subordinate members of the family. This is the way I would explain it. It changes with the development of what we're talking about in terms of the transatlantic slave trade. Uh, it's a completely different setup. Um, now, um, now these slaves that existed in these African families, we're talking about prior to the development of capitalism. Of course, this is what I'm talking about. Some of them did field work; they raised crops and so on, or cared for animals. Others worked in the home as domestics. Some were soldiers, and some slaves in some communities became influential. For example, if they were distinguished warriors, they would be a slave, but they could become, influential. They would have slave status, and yet um, they would be they would have prestige status in the community. Um, Things changed radically when the European slave trade develops on the African coast, and especially the center of the slave trade was West Africa, the western coast of Africa, the coast that the Portuguese, well, we mentioned this, the development of the first slave plantations by the Portuguese. It's along the west coast, the Atlantic coast, that the other side of it, the east coast, like places like Mozambique, had a place in this, but it was less than the west coast. Uh, and it was from the west coast that the great majority of black African slaves were dispatched to the slave plantations along the coast of Africa and in the Caribbean and eventually in the American South. Those were the areas where slavery developed in the early modern period. Um, now, there was some remnants of the old form of slavery that persisted, but this was something new because rather than this sort of, and I should add that slaves in this traditional African setup, after one generation or two generations, many of them were accepted as free men in the tribe. So slavery was not a hereditary condition in the case of this traditional servant. But with the Europeans, when they appear, the situation changes both in Africa and, of course, in the New World, because slaves become private property to be bought and sold. And this is a hereditary condition. The slave is what we call a chattel, a piece of property. So it's very different. It's much more intense. And of course, with all of the cruelties that go with this. Um, and the demand for slaves in the New World is sort of a big area was Brazil and the sugar plantations, but also the Caribbean, and that became the real center. The Caribbean was where most of the slaves were sent across the ocean, and so this became a real business. From the late 16th century until the 19th century, the slave trade became big business. Eventually, something like 20 million slaves taken in war were sent across the Atlantic Ocean to the New World to work in the plantations. In order to capture those slaves, the kingdoms, there were different sort of kingdoms that developed um, in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. Um, for example, the kingdom of Dahomey, the kingdom of Asante. These were what we can call slave kingdoms because basically the economy worked supplying the European traders with slaves. And in order to do this, the Europeans gave the chiefs, the kings, whoever, they sold rifles and cannon to the chiefs of these various slave kingdoms, and in return for which the slave kingdoms supplied the European traders with slaves taken in war. And so, first of all, a whole military apparatus developed in these armies, substantial armies, equipped with modern weapons, for one thing, and also then the merchant classes in these African kingdoms became rich through the slave trade. There were this whole sort of process of capturing slaves, moving slaves to the coast, selling them to the white men, and it was a business. Now, in terms of basically, these slave kingdoms became geared for war in order to secure new supplies of slaves. And if they went on slave hunting expeditions, these military forces into the interior of Africa, and they raided and they fought tribes, and they were quite powerful, and the captives that survived the wars basically became slaves and were shipped to the coast. The people of course, in the center of Africa, where this kind of raiding was going on, were basically, it was a state of permanent insecurity. When would the slavers come? When would they come from the coast and raid our villages and so on? So a permanent state of insecurity develops, and many people, they build forts, stockades, where people escape into the hills when they hear reports of the coming of the slave traders. And of course, the development of the Caribbean islands during the 17th and the 18th century, this is when these wars in Africa reached their peak. Total numbers, I said 20 million captives sent across the Atlantic to work in the trade. But the consequences for Africa were far greater because large numbers of people died in the wars or died in the course of being transported to the coast, or died because the conditions in the slave ships carrying people across the Atlantic were terrible. And as a consequence, mortality was very great, and it is estimated that 80 million people died between the 16th and 18th century as a result of this trade. And which, in terms of sort of, I said earlier, for example, when we talked about Latin America, the Latin American economy, as a result of the Spanish conquest, the plantations, the mines, it all became linked to exporting the wealth to Europe. We saw that in the Ottoman Empire, the same thing happened. uh, the the people of the Mediterranean and of the Middle East, they were not damaged quite to the same degree. But likewise, by the late 18th, 19th century, the French and the English dominate the Ottoman Empire. Same thing happens in India. And it all becomes geared to Europe. Europe develops, capitalism develops, the middle class develops in Europe. But these other places, and now we can include Africa, and Africa uh, uh, is affected most of all, they suffer uh, a process of undevelopment. As Europe develops, there is underdevelopment in all of these places. And of course, leaving out China because it's in the 19th century, but the same thing happens to China. So there's development and there's underdevelopment, and it's simultaneous. And that's why we have the kind of world that we live in. That's why we have the global South. This is what happened. So, as it turned out, the slaves taken to Africa were very important to its development because, as I explained, the tropical products which were being exported to Europe, the sugar, the cotton, and coffee eventually, it's rice, all of these products, they needed to be worked by intensive agriculture. The Aboriginal population had been decimated. Remember the Spanish, it was this terrible die-off of Aboriginal people as a result of the Spanish. They were not available, or they would not work on the plantations. They fled into the forests or up into the hills, so they were not available. And so these African slaves were available, plus because they came from tropical areas, they were peasants for the most part. They were perfect for working on the plantations. They were immune to the diseases of the Europeans. They knew how to work in tropical agriculture, and so their contribution in terms of their labor was very important. Now, in the 18th century, in terms of the sort of cultural consequences of all this, remember in terms of talking about the Spaniards and the sort of early European invasions of the Third World, particularly the Americas, the European attitude was, well, these people are heathens, they're not Christian. And yes, we're enslaving them and we're exploiting their labor, but we're doing them a favor, don't you know? We're converting them to the Christian religion, and they can ultimately go to heaven as a result. Or they would say, the Europeans, they would say that, well, people are running around virtually naked in Latin America, and it is only proper that people wear clothing to bear yourself is shameful, and so we're civilizing the indigenous people, or we're civilizing the Africans. Those were the justifications. But in the 18th century, the tone changes, those themes remain, but now racism becomes very important. The sort of idea, and this refers both to the indigenous The Americans called them red men. I don't know why. I haven't seen any red men in the streets of Winnipeg, but maybe I'm colorblind. But they called them red men, or black people, increasingly were seen as the indigenous could be dispossessed, and black people were seen as natural slaves, seen that they were inferior in various ways. They were biologically inferior. Biology was developing in Europe among scientists in the 18th century, and a sort of pseudo-science, race science developed. And so this idea of biological inferiority really comes to the fore in the 18th century. All sorts of laws were passed. In France, it was called the La Code Noire, the Black Code. In Spanish, other terms, prohibiting intermarriage, prohibiting the education of black people. This kind of stuff. Now, a small number of blacks, as a matter of black slaves, actually gained their freedom. They somehow put together enough money that they could become free men in the Americas. So you do have at the top of the African population in America by the 18th century, there's a certain class of free men, but the great majority of the black population remain as slaves. Definitely being black was linked with slavery. And as I say, this was by these scientists, this was justified biologically. A whole science began to develop, racist science in Europe in this respect. Now, it's interesting to note that, yes, there are the first publications along these lines date from the 18th century in Europe. But you should understand that by then, these racist attitudes, there was a lot of money being made in slavery, and so they had their intellectuals. Where there's money, there's intellectuals who will write about anything. They will justify anything. I'm warning you against people like me. If you give me money, if you give me enough money, I'll write a book justifying how you're making your money. I'm actually not referring to myself. I have enough money, just enough. I'm hard pressed. Increasingly, the inflation is killing me, but I have enough to get by. But there are intellectuals who are for sale. A lot of them. Some of them are in this university. And so what I'm saying is that these people wrote books because they were rewarded. It would be politicians also who did the same thing. Now, part of the reason for this was that a counter movement against racism and against slavery began to develop in the 18th century. I've been telling you a sad story. Well, this is the good part. In the course of the 18th century, as we're going to soon see, was what was called the Age of Enlightenment. Reason, science, experience, these became the new standard of truth in the 18th century. Suddenly, from out of, well, it emerged out of the scientific revolution. And notions of equality, notions of freedom began to circulate in the 18th century. More and more people were writing books along these lines. And to this element in society, slavery looked both evil and irrational. And so in the course of the 18th century, and first in England and then in France and elsewhere, an abolitionist movement developed, which basically said the slave trade and slavery itself is an abomination. It's irrational. That was a key word. And based on there's no way that you could justify this. And so an important movement of abolition developed in both France and England, and eventually it led somewhere. But at the end of the day, the black population took things into their own hands. Because when the French Revolution broke out in 1789, the biggest plantation colony in the world existed on the island of Haiti. There, which was a French possession, and it was the pearl of the French economy. It was the focal, but there were also Guadeloupe, Martinique, the French had those things, but especially Haiti. 5,000 sugar plantations, 500,000 slaves on Haiti. And the French were making fantastic profits from that. Well, word of the French Revolution reached Haiti. They first circulated amongst the white elite, then the black free men got wind of it, and then the slaves heard about it. And in the summer of 1791, the black population rose up and freed themselves. And this was a tremendous historical event. And it spread to various places. The slave owners on the other islands and in the American South were terrified at this event. They were terrified. And the Europeans tried to intervene. The French sent, Napoleon sent armies. The British sent armies to try and quash the revolution, but they could not. The black population had weapons, they fought well, and the Europeans failed to retake Haiti. So Haiti became, later, Haiti became a free republic. The leader, his name was Toussaint Toussaint Louverture. He was actually captured and died in captivity, but Dessalines and the other leaders carried on, and Haiti became a free republic. And what did the Americans and the Europeans do? They basically imposed a blockade of Haiti in the first part of the 19th century, and Haiti was made to pay for the people taking their freedom. Haiti was basically isolated by the Europeans, and it became increasingly impoverished, and the rulers became more and more corrupt, and Haiti became an increasingly miserable place. And this was made worse by, in the beginning of the 20th century, the United States became an imperialist country, and the Americans were sending their Marines into the Caribbean and all over Latin America. They were basically taking control of Latin America. And they invaded Haiti, and they established a kind of dictatorial regime, which has remained almost in place until this very day. Any attempt on the part of the Haitians to liberate themselves has been frustrated. However, I'm just finishing the story. And in the 1990s, a priest by the name of Aristide arose in Haiti, and he was elected, and he began a process of reform. The United States did not like this, and so they got rid of Aristide and brought back the corrupt politicians that they basically have been keeping in power. While this was happening, the situation in Haiti has since back at the beginning has been terrible, and it's gotten worse and worse. Um, the um, a the the French and the Canadians have become involved under the auspices of the United Nations. The Americans, the French, and the Canadians have occupied Haiti. But the situation has gone beyond that. As we speak, the people are in the streets in Haiti, and the situation cannot be controlled by the imperialist powers, including the Canadians, because they're terrified that if they send troops, they will be killed by the Haitians, who have weapons, they have leaders, although it's a situation of great chaos. And this is the situation as it is today. And of course, what they're really worried about is another Cuba in the Caribbean, because as sure as day, if the Haitians gain their freedom, the red flag is going up in Haiti. That is what the Western powers are afraid of. And I have to tell you that the Canadians are playing a lead role in all of this. They are completely complicit in what is going on. And of course, they're complicit all over Latin America. They're complicit in Africa. They're complicit in the mining companies, the oil companies, the banks in Canada. These are the people who determine the foreign policy of Canada. Enough of that. Back to the Enlightenment. Just to finish the story, the abolitionist movement, it succeeded because in 1807, the British abolished the slave trade. They didn't abolish slavery. They abolished the slave trade. You could no longer transport slaves across the ocean. But then in 1833, following, for example, rebellions in Jamaica, the British altogether abolished slavery, including slavery in Canada. Canada had some slaves. Slavery was abolished in 1833. And the French followed suit in 1848. The United States in 1863. But yes, the slave trade and slavery were abolished in these places in the middle of the 19th century. But lo and behold, we note that in Cuba and in Brazil, the abolition of this sort of slave labor system led to what we call the second slavery, because there was a huge demand for sugar in the 19th century, and it came mainly from Brazil and from Cuba. And it was only in the 1880s that these two places finally abolished slavery. So that's the story. We should then note that the revolution in Haiti, that's why I said it was so significant, because it was the beginning of this vast movement of liberation, prefiguring really the revolutions that basically began to break out at the beginning of the 20th century in the global South. The anti-colonial movements really, they predate the Russian Revolution. It started prior to the Russian Revolution. Anti-colonial people basically organizing themselves to basically overthrow European rule over them. But in terms of what was going on toward the end of the 18th century, we have to note that in Peru, the indigenous people in Peru, under a leader who considered himself a sort of a reviver of the Inca Empire. His name was Tupac Amaru. Although he failed it, was the first sort of anti-colonial uprising on the continent of Africa, Latin America. And likewise, in North America, the first time the indigenous began to sort of defend themselves against the white colonists came under the leadership of Pontiac, Chief Pontiac, I believe in the 1770s. So there's the beginnings of a resistance, is what I'm pointing to. But meanwhile, things were happening in Europe. Big things were happening in Europe. Because what we have is what we call this huge cultural movement, this cultural revolution called the Age of Enlightenment. And this is what I want to talk about now. Let me see how much time I have left. Because it's the background. In order to have significant change in society, you have to have ideas. Without ideas, you have no capacity to organize, and you have no capacity, you have no direction. What are you doing? So ideas play, the idea that it's all about money, it's all about economics. It is about money and economics, but it's also about ideas. Without ideas, nothing happens. So the ideas of the 18th century were very important, and these ideas were based on the scientific revolution, as I've already indicated. That is to say, Newton, there had been, of course, Galileo and Copernicus before him, and so on, but Newton, in his brilliance, was able to sort of, using mathematical and empirical principles and mathematics, he was able to basically develop a unified theory of physics and astronomy, and he demonstrated that, in fact, the universe operated according to rational principles. There were rational scientific principles, laws, if you like, which controlled the operation of the universe. Indeed, that the nature of, not only did it operate according to laws, but these laws were mathematical. The language of nature was mathematical. Now, the thing is that even Locke, he was trying to, through philosophy, sort of work out what the rational principles behind individual behavior and what society was all about. He was a friend of Newton's, and he was influenced by his philosophy by what Newton had achieved. Likewise, we saw that Smith, law of supply and demand. It's always a law. Things work. The market works in a rational way. This is part of a much larger framework that begins to evolve in the 18th century. Now, England, of course, the English were very interested in all this and so on, but they had developed a constitutional monarchy. They believed they lived in liberty, especially the middle class believed that. And they, based on parliamentary sovereignty, there was no need for revolution. However, in France, the situation was very different. France and the rest of Europe lived under absolute monarchies, Louis XIV, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, we see that it's not merely Louis XIV, but also in Austria, in Spain, in Russia, and in Prussia, in the center of Germany, the rulers are absolute rulers. Now, hitherto, they base their rule on the idea that they rule by divine light, divine right, or that they they uh, they rule because they had inherited their kingdoms and so on. But in the 18th century, even the monarchies are touched by the spread of this idea that nature is rational, society ought to be rational as well. And so they begin to say we rule by virtue of our enlightenment. We we have internalized these scientific ideas, and we're going to reform our societies on the basis of these principles. Just as nature operates rationally, we're going to try and reform our state and our societies in a rational direction. And so you do see that in many of these states, for example, now you have this is an age of bureaucracy. The old setups based on tradition, so on, and all that are swept aside, and the whole state systems are reorganized in terms of bureaucracies that rationally administer society. And we saw the military revolution. They have this idea of that you can develop the military principles. You can fight wars according to rational principles. I'll carry forward in the next class.